What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of JaAR. JaAR, for those of you that may be new, stands for Joe
and Amy
Review. This is our weekly show where we review the Magic stories. So, this week, we are here for Chapter 5 of The Gathering Storm by Django Wexler. My quick review, this one was good. I wouldn't say it was as good as last week's. I don't think a lot, jumped out at me as, oh my god, it's amazing. There was some pretty cool fight scenes in it, which I appreciated, and some intrigue. So it's still definitely worth a read, as all of these have been. But I don't think that this will be like, oh my god, Chapter 5 was one of my favorites. It's just, it was a fine work. I don't know if you agree or how you feel.
Okay. So my quick review is, it definitely is worth reading. But I will say it's worth reading. It does have fight scenes, but it has a nice contrast because I feel like the rest of it is just cute.
Mm-hmm.
So I like the cute parts. The fights are interesting. I love that sort of political back and forth kind of thing that happens. So yeah, it's good. It's all around good. There's quite a lot of contrast for the different parts, but I like that.
Okay, fair enough. So yeah, if you have the opportunity, try to find these. You can Google them. You should be able to find something that way. The Gathering Storm, if you didn't sign up for the newsletter to be emailed to you every week, or almost every week, then this is a fine way to do that. So yeah, on to the full review itself. The chapter started similarly to the way that the last one did, reminding us of the fact that we have heard a little bit of Ral's backstory. So we heard about Ral being with his, I guess at the time, boyfriend, Elias, and them having gotten a puppy. And then Django ties it right back into present, at least in the story, present day, with making Hekara, or walking with Hekara, akin to walking with that puppy. And so they're able to tie it back, but also subtly throwing in the mention of Nicol Bolas in there, just as a reminder of, oh, by the way, also Bolas was around back then. So it's kind of all of those things just tossed in, but it's a nice little, hey, remember this? Because again,
right,
if this were a full novel, split into chapters, it's still not a bad idea to do that quick reminder in case, you didn't hear it enough in the last chapter or whatever, and you never know when someone is going to stop for a period of time reading a book and then come back to it, and you don't want to have to go so referential that you're going to make the person feel like they have to reread the whole book up to the part where they stopped to understand it. Right. Now, maybe when we get to chapter 19, if they're still doing it, maybe then we'll say it's a little excessive, because if you've gotten all the way to chapter 19, hopefully you remember the main premise of the book at that point. But again, I think it's a fair thing, because we've complained about repetitiveness in the past, but I think this is just the right amount of a subtle nod and a subtle reminder of this past.
This is the way to actually do that.
Right, and it's done very well. Because then it immediately refers it back to where we are presently with, also, he's walking with Hekara now, right? So I thought that was very well done also. They are walking towards Vitu-Ghazi. So we get a bit of a description of the pathway up to Vitu-Ghazi, like the raised walkways that they mention, which, again, is nice. A little less than we've gotten previously in terms of detail and in-depth description, which I think I would have liked a little bit more for Vitu-Ghazi as a whole. Maybe they'll do it again later, but I think they did a good job of, it's a giant, city tree or whatever, but they didn't give the same grandiose description of Vitu-Ghazi as they did of Orzova or the spires of Izzet and stuff like that. So I think, weirdly, I think I would have liked more of it, but I think especially because I've been somewhat so conditioned to expect it now, so that may have been missing for me.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, that's not like a horrible negative, oh my god, this chapter sucks. It's just,
No, but I
you
can
know,
see it.
yeah, I would have liked it. It would have been kind of cool. And then we get another reminder / just a scene with Lavinia. Lavinia had been shown to us previously, I think it was like chapter 2 or something, where she meets up with Rahl, maybe even chapter 1, and kind of meets up with him in secret and is like, listen, I've kind of been ousted by the Azorius, but
Right.
I'm trying to help you out here. I'm working behind the scenes, and she continues to do that by saying, like, look, I'm trying to make sure you weren't followed here because
Right.
something's going on in Selesnya, and it may have to do with your visit today. Right. So watch your back. And Rahl's like, oh, all right, well, thanks for the heads up. Also, check on Vraska. Let me know what's going on, because she wants to meet with me, so I'd like to be somewhat prepared.
Right.
Which makes sense, right? Getting some recon, some information about what could be your enemy, and you want to make sure that you're not walking into a trap. So I think that made sense. I thought that was kind of cool.
Okay, yeah.
And that's something that's going on in Selesnya, we know, again, thanks to Lavinia, had to do with Bolus. Right? And that's kind of all that we knew. It was like Bolus's forces had something planned for over there. We will find out very quickly what that is. But it was a nice bit of foreshadowing for us and forewarning for Rahl of somewhat of what was to come.
Yeah.
Then we hear about the Tristani situation. And we know about this from the novel because it is where Kaya and Rat and Teo go to talk to Imara and Tristani to convince them to come to the second iteration of this guild summit that's trying to happen now. And we see that one of the three, the Trinity in Tristani, is kind of sealed off. And in the novel they come to. But here we find out from Imara that it has begun. Yeah. And so while Imara is not technically able to make decisions as the guildmaster, she's somewhat in charge. And what's cool is we saw in Guilds of Ravnica and Ravnica Allegiance the card sets. We saw the rare split cards for each guild depicting the two arts on the split cards were depicting the two people who were vying for control of each of the guilds. And in these stories, there are the subtle hints towards them. When we were in the Vraska story, Vraska talks to the assassin and is like, who sent you? Was it Izoni? Well, now we know from playing the cards that Izoni is the one depicted opposite Vraska in vying for control of the Golgari. Now you see Imara alongside Tristani, and Imara is saying, I don't technically make a full decision. She's like, but I have sway, and it's like, yeah, they're the two depicted there. So I really like that. I like that a lot. I like that's a way, I think, to tell a story through the cards that doesn't interfere with the story in the in the works of text of fiction, because these hint at it, and whereas the cards are a little more blatant, but that makes sense because they're cards. It's a lot harder to get across a full story. Yeah. In cards, you have to kind of be blatant about character traits and political intrigue, if you will, of vying for control. Yeah. But then they don't have to say it here. They don't have to say, was it Izoni? Because she is the one who also believes that she can fight me for control of the guild. Right. You don't need all that.
So I feel like she probably thinks that she has enough power to come over here and start to... No.
You don't need it. And that's why I like the comparison that we can draw where, sure, we see Imara, we hear her motivations and her opinions, and she even says, she's like, technically no one's really in control, but it's also technically Tristani, and I have pull, but I'm not great, so I liked it. I liked that a lot. Good. And I mean, again, you mentioned at the top liking political intrigue.
Yeah, so. Yeah. I've always been into that stuff, though.
It's pretty cool. It is pretty cool. And Imara...
I tend to like that a little bit more than fight scenes.
That's fair. No, that's fair, and it's interesting,
But
right?
they kind of went hand in hand in this story.
True. But it's also interesting. I mean, I'm a comic book guy, so I'm interested, or I'm used to fight scenes playing out with like at least still images, right? And so in text fight scenes, there's still something. It's hard. I think some of the time I find that there's something missing, and other times I'm like fully engrossed and I can picture it and stuff. So it's interesting to me because I kind of toy on that. I flip flop somewhat in terms of whether I appreciate it fully or whether I'm.
Well, I'm sure that just depends on how good the writing is.
That's true too. Yeah, but
So
I mean,
what would you say for this?
I knew you were going to ask that. That is a very fair question, Amy. I don't know. I thought this was okay. I thought the fight scene was somewhat short, and I also thought that there was the fight scene that happens immediately after the part that we're talking about now, which is the assassin coming in. And that's kind of one thing, right, where it's very quick. And that makes sense for an assassination attempt. So that's perfectly flavorful.
And honestly, I feel like that makes it feel a bit more realistic and a little less like a movie.
Yeah.
Because if it were happening in real life, it would be that fast.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it would feel rushed because you would just at the end you would just look around and go, what the hell just happened?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If it happened in real life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and in a movie they kind of draw it out. And in a comic book they kind of draw it out. And in this, they could, you know, they had an opportunity, I suppose, to have drawn it out.
Yeah.
And I feel like it was a bit more realistic because it wasn't.
Yeah, and again,
But
I think
I do agree that it did feel more rushed than what you would typically expect.
right. But like I said, I do think that makes sense. I think that's a fair thing that they chose to do. It was interesting because you had Rahl, who, I mean, he's a planeswalker. You'd think, like with most of these planeswalkers, especially in the lead up to War of the Spark, where they're all fighting in some way, and even a guy like Dak Faden, who is, you would consider him to be a thief, right? But he's able to steal spells from different people, and so he can use those spells. So he was doing a pretty darn good job of fighting until the obvious happened. But with Rahl Zarek, I mean, there was one assassin in the room, and Rahl had like a little bit of electricity in his fingers, and he kind of still couldn't stop her on his own. He needed Hikara, a non-planeswalker, to come in and slit her throat and do it. And so it's whether he was caught off guard fully and just couldn't get to the point of his power, or whether he really was like that inept at
Okay, so maybe they needed a bit more explanation as to like what
I don't know.
was happening.
I don't know, because again, then they talk about when they're fighting down the hallways to get his accumulator, and he says, you know, I could take on like one or two, but you guys have to do the rest. And so then you see Amara's abilities come into play. You see Hikara's abilities come into play and stuff like that. I think
Just needs time to recharge, kind of thing.
I guess. I think Amara was, before she created the elemental, I thought she was kind of one note in what she could do.
Okay.
Where it was just like, she made the tree grow and grabbed their ankles and wrists and stuff.
Yeah.
Now, don't get me wrong, the dialogue with her was incredible.
Yeah.
The things that she was saying, and that's her strength, right? No pun intended, is...
Well, she's a politician,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
So, yeah, I mean, that would be her strength.
Right.
A politician doesn't typically have to fight for their life because they usually have people around them to do that for them, right?
That line, why don't presidents fight the war? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's true though, right? The
Yeah.
president isn't on the... It's not at least for those of us in the States, right? It's not the American Revolution where Washington is standing at the front of the boat, right?
Right.
It's the president stays back and sends the soldiers out to
Right.
do that fighting for them. So
Right.
yeah, it makes perfect sense.
I mean, if you want to use that sort of example, there are plenty of examples of, you know, the general also being, you know, the main politician of the era, and they're the ones at the front line, literally, you know, pushing the forces in,
Mhm.
and took a while maybe we took a while maybe as a civilization or as a people to figure out that doing it that way is the best idea, because then you have to come up with a new ruler because yours died because
they were on the front lines.
They literally got murdered first because they were the first ones to infiltrate the line of the enemy.
And again, now you see whose strength is history and who has like the barest knowledge of it at all. So yeah, thank you for the more in-depth commentary there, because I would have been way out of my depth. So we hear a bit even after before the assassination attempt, after the assassination attempt, we hear about Glademaster Garrow. And Imara truly seems to think, like, listen, Garrow is a good guy, right? He's questioning some things that are going on, but he's a good man. He just wants what's best for Selesnya. And it's, I guess, Imara's concern is that there was no one with Tristani in turmoil, and the Dryads in general in turmoil. There was no one left to interpret the will of Matt Selesnya to find out what his will, or the World Soul's will, would be.
Right.
And so with that, that's where the turmoil comes in. And so Garrow's in one camp and Imara's in another. But again, she's swearing by the fact that he is still a good man. And that's why when the assassin comes in and just gets killed prior to finding out anything, usually that's a problem. And I don't think the story even got a chance to say, like, oh no, but now we don't know the motives. And because Raul was like, something's going on here. You need to figure out what it is.
It's not just, oh, here's an immediate threat. Let's take care of this immediate threat. We need to find out what the cause is.
Right. And that never, it was mentioned, but there, again, appropriately, there wasn't time.
Right.
Because then the guards rushed in. Because they were, as they then mentioned, they were told by Garrow that Imara was dead and that Raul had killed her. Mm-hmm. And so you have now, again, like Amy said, more political intrigue, because you have like, well, but she's not dead, but also you're still here, guard, aggressive towards Raul, even though you were told that I killed her, but she's right there, but you're still trying to come at me, even though I didn't kill her. This assassin was the one that tried to kill her. So that one maybe didn't fully, I didn't fully understand that, but I think also Imara, just at that point...
That conversation didn't really happen.
Right. Well, and also Imara, I think, was just so done at that point, right? There was already an attempt made on her life. She's done. She's not going to stand there and try to be like, well, let's try to figure this out and talk it out. No.
Right.
She
doesn't
grabbed
care at
him.
That point. She wants to,
Right, and she grew the wall out or whatever to grab the guy and hold him in place so that she could find out Garrow was the one who told him these things, so he came down to do his job. And that's the other thing about this political intrigue, was you didn't know. You didn't know whether the guards were just doing their jobs or whether they were all in cahoots and didn't care whether Imara was alive or dead.
Right.
And there were, I would argue, conflicting reports, or at least conflicting factions, right? Because that first guy that came in, when Imara ended up grabbing him, maybe he was going to attack Raul, or maybe if they had talked to him about the situation, he wouldn't have. Because there were other guards in the hallways later on who Imara was like, well, I'm here, I'm going to go see Garrow. And the guard was like, well, what about these two? Meaning Hekara and Raul. And they're like, the guard's like, well, I have to arrest them. And Imara's like, what, for my murder? And the guy's like, oh, well, and then they were able to go through because the guy had no combat to that.
He was given orders.
Correct.
Right? And so he can't just show up to the scene and then just decide not to do that simply because what he was told had happened didn't actually happen.
Right.
Because at that point he still didn't know what did happen, right?
But that's why Imara kind of calling him out and then having them all stop made sense.
Right.
But it also led Raul to kind of outwardly state, like, oh, okay, maybe they're not all bad.
Right.
Right? Maybe they're not all messing up or siding with Garrow. Maybe it is just they were given orders and they're trying to follow those to the best of their ability.
Right. And they show up to the scene and they just go, this isn't what I expected to see. I expected to see Amara dead, Rawl here killing her.
Right.
And
so that I have to take
else,
him in. Yeah.
You know, and now all of a sudden there's these extra people. One of them is dead, but it's not Amara. And it's supposedly the assassin who tried to take her life, even though it was supposedly Rawl. So.
And you know what the interesting thing is? I'm curious as well as to whether the removal of Rawl's accumulator was because of the setup from Garrow and they didn't want him to be able to fight his way out, or if that was just, in their eyes, a happy coincidence.
It might just be standard.
Correct.
You know.
Correct.
You know.
Because you're about to go into the, you know...
You're entering the chambers or whatever.
Yeah. It's definitely... I think it's like a toss-up, right, as to what it could have been. Yeah. And you don't really know. But then they fight their way to Rawl's accumulator, he puts it on, they fight their way to, or they get their way to Garrow, and at that point, that's where Amara is telling the people, no, you know, I'm right here, don't arrest them, they didn't kill me, hi, we're gonna go. And then they go, and they get to Garrow, and Garrow is in a room with 2 armed guards and a red-headed, I guess, druid of some kind, which we find out later. And Garrow's just kind of like... Rawl notices something wrong with him initially, but only lightly mentions it, and then never mentions it again. Just is like, there's something wrong with his eyes, it looks like he's dead inside.
Right.
And then just moves on again, because that's what's going on. And that's when Garrow's like, well, you know, this traitor Rawl Zarek, I'm glad you brought him to us. And the druid woman closes the doors, locks them up with tree overgrowth, if you will, and then they fight. Imara fights the druid. The 2 soldiers, one fights Hakara, one fights Rawl, and then when Rawl stops his guy, he then goes after Garrow. And in killing Garrow, well, I'm sorry. Let's stop there for a second. So that was another fight scene. So you asked me about fight scenes. That one I thought was fine. I thought that the part of Imara's elemental versus the redhead's elemental was very glossed over. It was just the 2 elementals are ripping at each other. And then the next time you hear about it, it's Imara and her elemental are standing over the redhead who's on the ground. And it's like, okay, so we didn't get to see that fight. Again, that somewhat makes sense because we're seeing this all from Rawl's perspective, and Rawl was a little preoccupied.
Right.
But yet...
And also, he doesn't necessarily care about this redheaded druid person, you know.
I mean, I'm curious as to who the hell she was. I mean, maybe she was just a random
too, when they
Silesian
started
person.
Describing her, but I think that's partially because they started describing her. And if they were going to not give importance to that person, it felt like they shouldn't have taken the time to do that.
Yeah.
And so it felt like they were going to give her importance. And so I think that's why you feel like that fight was glossed over, because they gave her the importance of describing her and making you think about who that might be, and then they rushed through the fight. Well, so I think if they had rushed through describing her as well, it would feel more natural for them to have rushed through the fight.
Well, and not only that, but I also not that I disagree with you. I think that's a fair point, but I also think that Imara was the one fighting her, right? Imara's kind of a big deal.
Yeah. And
so if this is Imara's opponent, I want to know who this opponent is of Imara's that matched her even for a period of time. I mean, Imara is good enough to be what I guess the bare bones version of the story would tell you is the next in line for guild leader if Tristani is not around for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. And so if that's the case, and this woman is on par for a period of time with Imara, yeah, I want to know more about her. I want to know who the hell she is, because if that's the case, if just any druid in Selesnya is able to match Amara for that period of time, that's pretty impressive. And Amara is kind of just squeaking by, it seems like.
Right, and scary, because that means there's going to be quite a few attempts on her life, I'd have to assume.
Fair point. Well, and then we find out, right? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. If you want to keep going with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a possibility that we'll learn more about her in the next story.
The redhead?
Yeah.
Interesting. Maybe.
Or at least the motives to the end that has,
okay.
You know?
Okay. Well, and you know what's funny? I guess maybe it's because JaAR was the only voice of dissent, or would have been the only voice of dissent, but after that fight, Imara is like, you know, whatever happened here, Rahl, don't worry about it. Selesnya will be with you. And it's like, nothing really changed from when you said you can't make those decisions.
Right.
But now you're saying that Selesnya will be with us, but you can't make those decisions.
Right.
You can't say that. So it's interesting.
Right,
I mean,
you're not more powerful now that someone tried to kill you.
Right. Right, or now that he's dead. I mean, Garrow is dead now, so is it because he's the Glade Master? And like I said, is it because he was the voice of dissent? And so now that the voice of dissent is gone, now she can make those kinds of decisions? I don't know. But it felt like besides that, nothing else changed, and I don't know, like if Tristani is supposed to be the leader and no one is stating the will of Matt Selesnya without Tristani and the Dryads, then why is Garrow dying the thing that makes Imara able to make that decision? Yeah. Maybe I missed something, because that's also assuredly a possibility. So if you know, let us know in the comments. I'm always welcome to be corrected or more informed. Mm-hmm. And if you have a guess, I'm welcome to those as well. Just let us know it's a guess. Because we guess things all the time, or try to, I mean, like educated guess, right? Like, oh, well, based on what I read, I feel like it's this, right? We do that stuff all the time. So, but yes, then we get to the moment where Garrow eventually is killed by Rahl, and kind of slumps over onto Rahl and says to him, kind of whispers in his ear, and Rahl notices the cadence in his voice is that of Nicol Bolas. And again, he would have known that if he had paid more attention to the fact that he knew there was something wrong with him, right? That his eyes were all glazed over or sunken and dead looking or whatever. So he was under Bolas's control. And he says, "You're Nicol Bolas?" And, well, not really, but the next best thing. Right. And says, "I'll see you soon," which is great. That was really cool.
Yeah.
Right, just that moment of like, this guy's dead, but I'm not him, so I'm coming. Don't you worry, I'm on my way, right? That was a really cool moment. And I also thought that was a good bookend. The beginning of this story reminded you that Bolas exists in Rahl's life from the past. And his relationship with Bolas. Just a quick reminder, but it just allows you to think back to the prior chapter that you read where that was a little bit better explained. And then the end of Rahl's portion of the story ends with him once again talking to Nicol Bolas, or hearing from Nicol Bolas. It's just a really nice bookend and a nice, I mean, again, this is leading into War of the Spark, which is everybody versus Bolas's forces. And so it's a nice way of, even though these stories are on Ravnica, tying Bolas into everything that is happening.
Yeah.
Every single chapter that involves Rahl Zarek, now that we've done this flashback, involves Nicol Bolas as well.
Right.
Every single one.
Because he's tied himself into his life so thoroughly. You really get to see that sort of timeline actually, like, build.
Yeah.
You can see each piece of that timeline where Nicol Bolas has integrated himself so fully into Rahl's life. And then you can compare it to everyone else who has had Nicol Bolas integrated so thoroughly through their lives as well.
And, I mean, and you do, right? You hear about it from all of the different characters. Veraska has talked about it in the past. Kaya has talked about it in the past, and then later in this story talks about it as well. So you're right. It's not. I mentioned it was Raul Zarek, but you're absolutely right. It's everybody. Niv Mizzet has talked about the impact that Bolas is going to have. Imara mentions the planeswalker aspect and understanding that, what a planeswalker is, and even says, which I thought was kind of cool, at first I thought it would be weird, but it actually makes perfect sense, right? Imara said she feels like she understands it perfectly, which is great. I think that was a fine way of mentioning it and moving on, because at this point everyone in Raul Zarek's life knows what a planeswalker is, and he's got to be okay with that, because it seems to just be happening all over the place. But yes, then speaking of which, then we get to the last part of this story, which is from Kaya's perspective. And we have Kaya being snuck up to see Teyza by Tomek. And I think the big takeaway here is just, we've been talking about it for the last 2 weeks, finally we get to see where that breakdown moment is in the Raul Tomek relationship of keep guild business and personal business separate. And I swore, based on what they were describing, that it was going to be Raul who was going to have to break it, because Raul was the one that brought it up twice previously.
Right.
But instead, it's now Tomek who has at least brought it up, right? There is definitely a possibility where Tomek chickens out and doesn't do it when push comes to shove. But at this point, as far as we know, Tomek is going to go to Raul and suggest to him that he put an attack on the Orzhov, so that Kaya can get down to the Obsidat and kill them. And we'll see what that does. I mean, obviously, again, we know they are still together in the time of War of the Spark, but we don't see them together a lot. So does it put a strain on their relationship? Because I feel like it should.
Yeah.
If Raul finds out that that's what happened and that that's why these things were happening. But Tomek also, it's kind of funny, Tomek tries to downplay their relationship to the ladies, to Kaya and Teyza, but also says, this is what I hear on the streets, is what Raul is trying to do. And I'm trying to remember back to the other stories, or I was trying to remember back to the other stories. I think that might be true. I don't know that Raul talked to Tomek about this guild summit, or did he? Maybe he did and just stopped short of asking him to help out with getting the Orzhov there.
Yeah, perhaps.
I don't exactly remember.
I don't either.
But again, it's what we've been talking about for the past couple weeks.
Yeah.
It's just that, guild business and personal business, keep them separate, and that's not what's happening.
And yeah, I mean, that's the only reason why they kept on mentioning that, is because obviously it wasn't going to stay that way.
It's Chekhov's gun. It's like the only principle of writing that I know. And I talk about it quite often.
Too often.
Well, and yet it keeps coming up.
Yeah.
So, when you know what to look out for.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's really it that I had for this story. I mean, again, I thought it was good. There were good moments. We got to see some cool characters and hear different aspects of them. Again, the Bolas bookend I thought was very smart, very well done. And then the little teaser of, Tomek is going to go ask Raul these things, and what's that going to do to their relationship? I'm definitely curious, and that would have gotten me to turn the page to the next chapter and keep reading. So I'll do this. This is going to be really corny. But if you want to turn the page to the next chapter and find out what we thought of that next chapter, all you have to do is subscribe. The button will be right up here towards the end of the video. You can click or tap that, or just scroll down and actually subscribe. It doesn't have to be in the video itself. And you can find out when all of our videos come out. It helps us out a lot. Plus, if you enjoy it, it's a great way for you to find out what's going on. It's YouTube. Hopefully you guys know how YouTube works. But
by this point.
Right. I mean, to be fair, I mean that in the most basic sense, because I feel like even their top creators don't know how YouTube works.
Well, yeah.
That's us included. Trust me, that's not me being like, they're dumb and I know everything. No.
I feel like maybe people who work for YouTube don't even necessarily know how YouTube works to its fullest extent.
I agree with that. Anyway, let's not bash the platform we're all on. Regardless, regardless, give us any and all thoughts that you have on this story, on this episode, on our thoughts, on your thoughts in the comments down below. That's what they're there for. It is a great way to show off your...
Hashtag Vorthos Pride.
It's true, it's important. And yeah, thank you all so very much for watching this episode of JaAR here on Geek for All. I have been Joe.
And I'm Amy.
Stay tuned for some other stuff. And as we always say, in whichever video of ours you watch next, we will see you all next time. Thanks, everybody.